Starting out, here are my early thoughts on it. I would say that I'm not necessarily surprised by the fact that you struggle with some big overdraws and some blocks to the right and a lot of double crosses whenever you try to fade the ball. I think that you have certain matchups in your swing that are always going to lead to those types of tendencies and results. And long term, obviously, the goal is going to be to get rid of them. So, setup position looks really good. Balance points look like they're in order. There's nothing here that stands out that's overly worrisome. Now, I will say you sent me a video in full speed. Long term, I would ideally like to see slow motion videos for future lessons. For now, this is certainly doable. Okay. Now, as you take the club back, so we see obviously pretty common tendency of golfers, which is like very disconnected lead arm in the backswing. So your left arm is really far and out away from your chest. So in the takeaway, rather than the hands working around your body this way, your hands are kind of just like shooting and rotating up and away from you. Now, when you combine that with the fact that your forearms are also rotating open, that can cause the shoulder plane at times to get a little flat, although in your case it's not so bad, but it can really rotate the club face open. Now, obviously, your grip is very, very strong, so your grip tends to offset the face angle to prevent it from opening up. In theory, most golfers at this point, although it's blurry, you would see the toe much more up and back than what yours is. Yours, again, it's very blurry. We can kind of see the face angle okay. Now, as you continue to go up, your left arm is, again, really far out in front of you. Hands are really far out in front of you. There's not a huge rotation of the pelvis here. There's a little bit of a rotation of the lower body, but it's very small, maybe 15, 20 degrees by this point. And like I said, when we don't rotate the hips a ton and the hands kind of work out and up, the combination of those things is going to create, obviously, the hands that are just really too far out in front of your body in the backswing. These are things that, for me, are creating the chain reaction of problems, and you're going to see how this affects the rest of the golf swing. The only reason your shaft is very flat at this point was because of the fact that you rotated your forearms early, which tends to pitch the shaft into a flatter position. So that's why you see the butt end of the club obviously pointing way outside the golf ball here. Now, as you get up towards the top, you obviously reroute the shaft really well. So the club head gets, more or less on plane in terms of its alignment. It's not too across the line. It's certainly not as laid off and flat as it was before. It's right down the plane line. In your case, this is essentially because as you go up, you create much more of a flying elbow, and we call that essentially internal shoulder rotation. And that kind of flying elbow, that positioning of your trail arm, it helps the club to work more across the line, which in your case doesn't actually get it across the line. It just takes it from a very flat position and just gets it back on plane, essentially. So that's kind of how the unique matchups are working out within your backswing, okay? Now, here is the problem. Because of how your backswing took place, yes, the club is, in a good position at the top. The alignment of the shaft is good. The face angle obviously is not going to be open because your grip is very strong, so that part's fine. But a much bigger concern to me than anything that has to do with the club face angle or the shaft alignment is the fact that your lead arm is obviously super upright, like significantly up above your shoulder plane, right? And so you see that at this point, your hands are really not that far around your body. You have essentially what we call no depth, meaning your hands aren't far enough behind you, right? So think of like a golfer who's in a flatter position, like a Rory, for example. That would be a lot of depth. You're a little bit closer to like the Justin Thomas type of backswing structure, right? Now, this is in part because of what you did with the disconnected takeaway. This is in part because of the fact that your hip turn isn't significant. You have maybe, again, that 20, 25 degrees max of hip turn, but it's not like you're loading super deep into the right hip. Now, here's the situation you're in. Because of how your backswing took place, the only way for you to get this club to not come down super steep into the ball, you have to slide aggressively towards the target and keep the back, or the chest, I should say, rather, tilting a little bit down and back. Meaning there is a strong reaction from the pivot in transition to give you a chance to reroute this club into a good enough position. Some people will call it, let's say, like the slot, that prevents this club from getting super steep. Now, the problem is that reaction from the pivot that we see is essentially a shallowing move very late that usually can get the golfer stuck under pressure. And this is something you'll see when I bring up the face-on video as well. But essentially, super upright lead arm. Like I said, not a lot of hand depth, kind of restricted hip turn. Yeah, we saw the whole backswing structure how it took place. And then on the way down, there's a big time lowering of the arms. Obviously, the hands are still very far out in front of you because of the backswing. We see the shaft is quite steep. It's even pitching over the right shoulder here because of the lack of lead arm depth in the backswing. And then from there, the only way to get this club to drop to the inside, we saw a lot of lateral movement from the lower body, and we see the upper body kind of tilting back at impact. So that's when the chest gets a little bit stuck. You see the right shoulder exits very low. You'll see the left shoulder exit very high. You'll see an excessive amount of trail side bend, and you'll see like the shoulder plane all bunched up and just not the chest opening up freely and a little bit more level around you. So all of these things, right, that reaction from the body, the jammed up left shoulder, the stalling of the chest, the sliding, all that, they are essentially reactions to give you a chance to shallow the club. And that is essentially happening because of the alignments you have at the top. Now, in theory, we can just get rid of the sliding and tilting back. Like, we can just get your pivot improving on its own. But in doing that, the hands are going to get out in front of you. The club's obviously going to be much steeper into the ball. And so your strike would improve. Your ball flight would certainly become more consistent, but you would lose any draw effect that you have in the golf swing. Like, it would become a very heavy fade biased pattern just because of the steepness due to the lack of arm depth combined with like any rotational work that we would do. So changing the way the body moves without changing anything else, it would get you a lot steeper into the ball. Yes, you would be more consistent in theory on the strike and stuff, but it would get you very fade biased. Like, your path would work pretty far left. If we wanted to keep the path where it is, or we wanted to get you more consistent as a whole, we would have to simultaneously get the lead arm a little bit deeper and flatter, meaning the arm structure a little bit more neutral, not as upright. And we would do that through, obviously, some backswing changes, getting the hands a little more around the body, getting the right hip to load a little bit better. And then from there, obviously, early on in that process, you might be even more draw biased, which is the risk involved. Because obviously, you have a lot of shallowing moves on the downswing. If we now get your lead arm in a more neutral position on the way back, that would amplify the shallowness. So obviously, we have to take that into consideration as well, which is why we need to have a follow-up conversation from this. But we would incrementally get the lead arm a little bit flatter. So some subtle changes to the backswing, and then immediately fix the pivot. If we start with the pivot, you can become pretty damn good. You wouldn't necessarily, struggle too much with strike or anything like that. But of course, like I said, early on in that process, you would be very fade biased. And then we neutralize the fade bias by getting the lead arm deeper. It's just like different ways to approach this tendency. So that's kind of what I'm seeing here with the pattern. And then obviously, just as kind of a follow-up to that, you can see what I'm referring to here, which is like you get to the top of the backswing, obviously super tall lead arm. You have this phenomenal pivot on the way back. Really like the loading pattern, although the hip turn's a little restricted, but overall it's pretty good here. But then you can see the shallowing move right here, which is like a whole lot of sliding aggressively towards the target, right? And a whole lot by P6-ish, which is kind of like around this area. So by shaft parallel, we can see the chest already starting to tilt back. Left shoulder's going up, right shoulder's going down, and the spine is starting to tilt away from the target. And that's what leads to the inconsistencies, because essentially, as your body does that so much, that tilting back, that is a shallowing move that gets you stuck at the last second. And so if you try to fade it from there, it's just going to lead to push cuts or double crosses. It's too hard to get the path left with how your body's tilting. So obviously, we have a lot of different routes we can go here. I just would love to hear from you a little bit first, your thoughts on all this, and then obviously we can come up with a game plan together to fix it.